Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is my response to the Week 2 discussion question, which asks why the United States has, for the most part, carried out foreign policy in Saudi Arabia that is ineffective and, as Dr. Meredith puts it, bad policy. My initial reaction when I thought about this question is that you have to look at the role that Islam plays in the foreign policy arena, especially as you consider that Saudi Arabia is what many people consider the most closed or most traditionally Islamic nation in the Middle East. And as Jacobs writes in chapter 2 of his book, there was an obvious clash between modernity and tradition in the mid 20th century. That is when the United States began having a foreign policy relationship with Saudi Arabia. And Jacobs notes that for the most part, American policy actors believed that there were essentially two groups of Muslims in the Middle East. There were the traditionalists, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, who did not like Western influence in the Middle East and wanted to return to traditional Muslim values and to essentially eradicate what they saw as the corrupting influence of secular ideas in the Middle East. And many of these policy actors saw Saudi Arabia as kind of fitting into the first group, more of the traditionalists. And then there's the second group, which were the more, I guess you could say, the more modernized or moderate Muslims who may be Western educated, were not necessarily overtly religious, and who were not opposed to Western influence in the Middle East. I am not overly familiar with the U.S. Relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I don't really understand why Dr. Meredith would say that most of American foreign policy in Saudi Arabia is bad policy. And like I said, my initial reaction is that I think you have to understand that Saudi Arabia has a different holds different values than the United States does, and it may be that these values are not they're not compatible. You can't necessarily make a foreign policy work in a particular country if you don't hold the same values as that country does. That's what I would think of. That may be the primary reason why U.S. policy in Saudi Arabia hasn't worked. And the second thing that I can think of, as Jacobs wrote, as he continued to talk about in chapter 2, and especially in the introduction in chapter 1, that American knowledge of the Middle East was not necessarily politically oriented or necessarily accurate before the mid-20th century. And a lot of foreign policy that began in the I think it was the late 1940s when the U.S. began its foreign policy in Saudi Arabia was influenced by these westernized notions of what the Middle East really was like. And I think that probably led to policymakers making assumptions about the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, that were not necessarily accurate.